Thank you. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Well, something remarkable happens in the late 18th century in that an entire society deeply invested in slave trading and slave holding falls to debating the very legitimacy of slavery. And I think that's something historically unprecedented. By the 1770s, the Atlantic slave trade is in full swing. The British have become the world's leading slave trading nation. British ships from Liverpool and Bristol are transporting 30 or 40,000 Africans every year across the Atlantic to slave plantations in the Caribbean and North America. And the British Caribbean and the American South have become slave societies. But suddenly, in the 1770s and 1780s, you get the birth of an abolitionist movement, an organized movement. There had been previous voices speaking out against slavery and slave trading, but for the first time you get a mass anti-slavery movement, and that is a unique and unprecedented phenomenon. You get a great outpouring of print, of sermons, of pamphlets, of poetry. You get mass petitions, hundreds of thousands of people in the 1780s and 90s signing petitions against the slave trade. In the 1810s, over 1 million Britons signed petitions against the international slave trade. In the 1830s, over 2 million signed petitions against slavery itself. You get a sugar boycott, a boycott of sugar produced in the West Indies. Hundreds of thousands of people stopped consuming sugar from the West Indies as a protest against slavery, and you get major debates on the floor of the House of Commons featuring some of the great orators of the day, William Pitt, Charles James Fox, Edmund Burke, and William Wilberforce, the figure whose name is at the top of this particular cup. By 1807, the British Parliament and the American Congress have agreed to abolish their respective Atlantic slave trades. By the 1830s, the British abolish slavery itself in the British Caribbean. In America, the abolitionist movement faces much more of an uphill task, and it's not, of course, until the 1860s, as a result of the American Civil War, that slavery is finally abolished in North America. But by the 1880s, it's been abolished across the Atlantic world. So this is a historically remarkable development. Over the course of a century, you go from the birth of an abolitionist movement to the abolition of slavery across the Atlantic world. So what did the Bible have to do with this? Well, the Bible had been used to construct and defend colonial slavery. And that's one of the reasons why the Bible had to be used to deconstruct it. The sheer prestige of the Bible meant that it had to be deployed, it had to be mobilized if one was going to win an argument about almost anything in this society, and we've seen some examples of this already today. To understand this, we need to kind of think about the distinctiveness of Protestant slave societies. So within Catholic slave societies, colonization had gone together with evangelization. Priests had followed conquistadors, and from the very beginning, enslaved people had been baptized into the church. One of the features of Protestant slave societies is a profound resistance to conversion on the part of planters. Planters see religion as one of the identity markers that separate white masters from heathen slaves. And they will even invoke Old Testament Israel to justify this, that the Hebrews were not allowed to perpetually enslave their brethren, but could perpetually enslave foreigners or strangers. And so they map their own experience onto that of the Israelites. Missionary Protestants, of course, are very disturbed by this. For them, it's a huge problem that there is this barrier to the universal spread of the gospel. And so what they have to do in the 17th and 18th centuries is persuade Protestant planters that conversion will not threaten slavery. So what they develop in the course of the 18th century, and there's a very good new book on this by Catherine Gerbner with the memorable title Christian Slavery, what they do is try and persuade Caribbean planters and masters that Christianity and slavery can go together. And so they construct a biblical defense of slavery and argue that slavery itself can be used as a vehicle for the gospel. Part of the argument here, of course, is that the Atlantic slave trade is itself providential, that bringing people from heathen darkness to the New World exposes them to the light of the gospel and Christian civilization. But they also want to show that conversion, baptism, even slave literacy will not jeopardize the master-slave relationship. That Christianized slaves will be loyal and docile. And in order to do that, of course, they invoke the household codes of the New Testament and the injunction to slaves to obey their masters. They also turn to the language of race. One of the problems they have, of course, is how do you justify the fact that you're enslaving a particular people, particular set of people, Africans? There have been some attempt to enslave Native Americans. There have been, of course, indentured labor of white servants. But nevertheless, this becomes a form of slavery that is fundamentally racial and racially targeted. So they have to defend this. And here they resort to notorious and one of the more dubious kinds of pro-slavery exegesis, which is a resort to Genesis 9 and these biblical genealogies where they trace the line from Ham through to Africans and say that the curse that was placed on Canaan explains the enslavement of Africans. That this is a people who are under a sort of divine curse. As I said, that's dubious, and in the 19th century, many biblical commentators were happier defending slavery in the abstract than they were defending racial slavery. Nevertheless, it's very widespread. To take just one example, the great Moravian leader, Count Zinzendorf, when he visits the Danish island of St. Thomas, preaches to a black congregation and says that God punished the first Negroes with slavery. So a clear reference to the curse of Ham, or the kind of curse of Canaan. So biblical genealogy could be used to undercut biblical monogenesis. The solidarity of mankind, the sons of Adam of one race, was undercut by an emphasis on the providential ordering of races and the subordination of Africans. So when the abolitionist movement arises in the 1770s, 1780s, they face this fully developed ideology of racial superiority and of biblical pro-slavery. One of the black abolitionists in Britain, a man called Ottobah Cugoano, complains that the claim that the Bible sanctioned slavery was the greatest bulwark of defense which the advocates of slavery can advance. Now, it's well known that in the United States, a powerful pro-slavery Protestant apologetic was developed in antebellum America. And historians have often thought that in Britain this was less important, but recent work emphasizes that the Bible was, in fact, central to British pro-slavery. The mobilization and use of the Bible was very important to it. And the essential argument is that if Abraham owned slaves, and Moses sanctioned slavery, and Paul countenanced it, if it was good enough for them, it's good enough for us. So there is this biblical pro-slavery argument that the abolitionists have to confront. They have a particular problem from the 1830s. So in the early days, they're looking to abolish the slave trade, and then the hope is that slavery itself will gradually wither. Once the import of slaves from Africa is finished, slavery itself will gradually wither away. They realized by the 1820s that that's not going to happen. Slavery is, if anything, particularly in the United States, growing fast and becoming more entrenched. And so you get a new push for emancipation from the 1820s and 1830s onwards. And many of these new abolitionists are immediatists. In other words, they demand the immediate emancipation of black slaves. And in order to do so, they argue that slaveholding, is not just an evil, it's a sin for which you should repent immediately. It's like being in adultery. You need to repent of it, and if you don't, your church should discipline and even excommunicate you. So they're making a very, very strong claim, and a claim that, of course, is very difficult to justify from the New Testament. So by raising the stakes, if you like, the immediatists face a bigger problem about how you justify their position from the Bible. Now, abolitionists are sort of at sixes and sevens over how you deal with the problem of biblical slavery. One way is to avoidance. So William Wilberforce, the leading spokesman for abolition in the British Parliament, is quite clear that he does not bring up biblical arguments in parliamentary speeches. That's partly to do with convention, but it's also to do with the worry that you get sucked into a sort of exegetical trench warfare that doesn't really advance the argument. Much better to stick at a sort of high moral, rhetorical level than to get down to a sort of nitty-gritty of particular biblical texts on the floor of the House of Commons. A second strategy is, if you like, denial. It's to deny that the Bible ever does endorse slavery. Now, if you read the King James Bible, this is easier to do than you might think, because in the King James Bible, words like the Hebrew ebed and the New Testament word doulos are translated as servant. So the Bible is full of servants, not full of slaves, if you read the King James Bible. And you get a kind of Protestant literalism in this period which simply denies that the Bible ever endorses perpetual enslavement, unless in the sake of the Canaanites, which is a punishment, a penal subjection because of their crimes. It's also common to argue that Hebrew slavery has now been abrogated. So there's an appeal to the covenantal development between Old Testament and New Testament. Granville Sharp, who's the sort of the father really of the British abolitionist movement, argues that the Hebrews were not allowed to keep their brethren in perpetual slavery. They had to emancipate them. The Jubilee legislation and so on required this. He argues that what the gospel has done is universalize that command. That under the gospel, which reaches out to all and which abolishes the wall between Jew and Gentile, all of mankind are our brethren. We are made citizens of the world. Everyone is our neighbor and brother, and therefore we cannot subject any of our brethren to perpetual enslavement. There's also an appeal to divine accommodation. So the idea here is that even if the New Testament did accommodate slavery, this was because, in the 18th century, you have a strong contrast not just between barbarism and civilization, but the development of a stadial theory of history, that societies progress through different stages. And one of the great Scottish Enlightenment historians, William Robertson, who's himself a pioneer of this approach, preaches a sermon in which he argues that early Christianity is accommodated to this more primitive kind of society, but what the gospel has done is has this sort of subversive seed that will grow over the centuries, and as society progresses, slavery itself will be undermined by the gospel. So this idea of societal, civilizational progress is invoked as well. As that develops, particularly in the 19th century, it could lead to the idea that there is a yawning gulf between the rather primitive morality of antiquity and the progressive, enlightened morality of modernity. The more you think that there is this sort of yawning gulf, the more you're likely to go in the direction of liberal Protestantism. So liberal Protestantism in America develops to some extent out of reflection on slavery, and there's a book by Molly Oshoutz which explains this. The other way you can go, and this is what's particularly striking about American abolitionism, is to come to doubt the authority of the Bible altogether. One of the striking features of American abolitionism in the second phase, from the 1830s onwards, is that it's sort of born out of a religious revival movement, the Great Awakening. Many of its key figures, like William Lloyd Garrison and Gerrit Smith and Theodore Dwight Weld, are shaped by the fervor of the Second Great Awakening. But each of those people also lose their faith in the Bible and their faith in Christianity and end up outside organized churches and Christianity. And some of that is to do with the bitter disillusionment they experience as they see the failure of their argument to win over the churches. And for pro-slavery apologists, this is terrific. This shows that abolitionism is actually linked with infidelity. What really drives it is secular philosophy. It's not the Bible. They can then portray the northern abolitionists as skeptics, as liberals, as infidels, whereas the South is a godly, biblical, patriarchal society. And so that self-image of the South really sort of develops in the period. And some historians, in particular Mark Knoll and the Genoveses, have actually argued that in the United States, the abolitionists lost the exegetical war, that the pro-slavery side succeeds in blocking their argument. They don't win over the churches. There's only really small religious sects who come on board with immediate emancipation. And they argue that one of their mistakes was to choose the wrong battleground. So what they try and do is argue that the Bible is opposed to slavery per se, slavery in the abstract, instead of focusing their argument on racial slavery and the difficulty of justifying racial slavery from the Bible. So on this reading of the situation, the Bible can look like a liability for the abolitionist movement. But there is another side to the story. Roy Porter, himself a very distinguished historian of the Enlightenment, once wrote that the campaigns in England, which first secured the abolition of the slave trade and then of slavery itself, were led by evangelical Christians and Quakers, not by the liberal intelligentsia. Now, you could finesse that statement, but there's quite a lot of truth in it. David Bryan Davis has written that from Sharp and Wilberforce to Buxton and Sturge, religion was the central concern of all the abolitionist leaders. Let me just show you this particular image. This is a picture of one page of the Bible of William Wilberforce, which is in the Wilberforce Museum in Hull, and it's very heavily annotated. Nobody's ever studied it. We have also a similar example of Thomas Clarkson's New Testament. Again, there's never been any study of this, but what it shows is how close a reader of the Bible he was. And as he goes, this is going through Deuteronomy, and he has a number of abbreviations he writes in the margins against certain texts. And in this particular text, these texts about care for the poor and the needy, he's writing benevolence beside it, which is, of course, a very 18th century word. 18th century moral philosophy makes a great deal of benevolence. In some ways, Wilberforce is reading the Bible through 18th century eyes. But abolitionism is shot through with the Bible, biblical quotation and citation. Granville Sharp, who I've just mentioned, was a keen scholar of Hebrew and Greek who deployed his linguistic skills to defend Trinitarian orthodoxy against the Unitarians. But he also saw his argument against the pro-slavery cause as a defense of the honor of the Holy Scriptures. Wilberforce and Clarkson recommend the Bible to the King of Haiti, Henri Christophe, in the 1810s, and want him to distribute the Bible to his citizens. And in the United States, William Lloyd Garrison, even though he loses his faith in the infallibility of the Bible, his rhetoric continues to be absolutely steeped in it. So he signs off his letters with phrases like, yours for the deliverance of all who are bowed down, yours for the reign of Christ throughout the earth, yours to redeem every bondman, years for the Jubilee. That's the most common biblical phrase that he uses to sign off his letters. And abolitionism, in many ways, is unthinkable without the Bible. And the reason for that is that the leading abolitionists and those who follow them model themselves on the Hebrew prophets. And the prophetic scriptures are constantly mobilized in abolitionist discourse. Here's Granville Sharp in 1776, the year of the American Declaration of Independence, when the Americans and the British are beginning the war of independence. He writes this whole treatise called A Law of Retribution, which is arguing that if you read through the history of the Old Testament, what you see is that God judges nations for oppression. And he puts together all of these texts which show that oppressive nations come under divine judgment. There's profound apprehension in the 1770s in both America and in Britain that the two nations the war is a kind of judgment on the two nations. And so there's this heart-searching as to why this has happened. And it's during this particular moment that many people on both sides of the Atlantic become convinced that they are being judged for the sin of oppression, for the slave trade, and for slavery itself. So that's why the American Revolution is kind of really pivotal, one reason why it's really pivotal for the emergence of the abolitionist movement. Now, there are different ways we could look at, different sources we could look at to examine the importance of the Bible for abolitionism. We could look at poetry, for example. We could look at sermons or speeches. We could look at African-American abolitionist writing, of which there's a great deal, or the literature around slave revolts. I've recently been working on a slave revolt in Demerara in 1823, which arises out of a missionary chapel. And the missionary is put on trial for inciting the slaves to rebellion. And at his trial, the questions are all about his use of the Bible. He's systematically read through the Bible to his slave congregation I think he's got to 2 Chronicles. He started in Genesis and got to 2 Chronicles and done most of the New Testament. And the argument against this man, John Smith, is that he has been grossly irresponsible in reading this incendiary text to a slave population. He's imprisoned and he dies in prison and he becomes a kind of martyr figure back in Britain. But what I want to focus on in the latter part of the talk is a number of examples of abolitionist imagery and the way that biblical texts are used in this imagery. Here you can see the symbol of the abolitionist movement, a kneeling slave pleading for his freedom under the slogan, "Am I not a man and a brother?" And one of the things that's happening with abolitionism is that the enslaved are being recategorized as brethren. I mean, that's a really critical kind of move. And that, of course, also has a really important effect on how you read the enslaved into the biblical narrative. You know, once you kind of see them as brethren, you move them from texts that are simply about slavery to a wider range of texts. It's been a controversial image among recent critics. You know, it's often seen as a subjugated petition from an enslaved black to a benevolent white liberator. But the notion of equality is still there, and it's symbolized by this particular handshake and by the rather biblical phrase, "May oppression cease throughout the earth." It could be combined with other texts. Here's another abolitionist medal, this time combined with the Golden Rule. Abolitionists also produced tableware that people can have on their tables, branded with certain slogans and images. So here we have an example of a sauce boat from the 1820s, and the text that's on it is actually from Acts chapter 7, and it's from Stephen's speech in which he's going through the history of Israel, and he looks back to the enslavement of the Hebrews in Egypt. So here again you have a radical reframing of Atlantic slavery. those who are enslaved are seen as the children of Israel, the Hebrew children in Egyptian bondage. And of course, that also radically reframes the British nation as well. The British are now looking like Pharaoh's taskmasters. Or here's a vase from about the same period with a verse from Ezekiel 22:29. The people of the land have used oppression and exercised robbery. So here the mobilization of the prophetic text is particularly striking. Here we see another plate from around the same period. You probably can't see the particular text, but the image is of a woman mourning her dead child. So you have an enslaved woman mourning the child. And the texts around it, one is from Isaiah and from Hezekiah's prayer, I am oppressed, undertake for me. And the other is from Lamentations, I labor and have no rest. Our necks are under persecution. So here enslaved Africans are being put into the biblical text as the oppressed, as those who are under oppression. Or another example, this is an East Indian sugar bowl, again from the 1820s. So abolitionists who didn't take West Indian sugar would sometimes take sugar from East India, which was not meant to be produced by slave labor. And here you have the invocation of Leviticus 25, ye shall not oppress. And also a reference, and one of the interesting things here is that they're using relatively obscure biblical texts. So 2 Chronicles 28:11, deliver the captive again, which ye have taken captive, are the words of the prophet Oded as he addresses the Israelites who've taken captive 200,000 Judeans and taken them to Samaria. So the British are being addressed as if they are these Israelite oppressors of their brethren who've handed them over, and they've been told to liberate them. And New Testament texts could be deployed as well. One particularly common one, which you see on an abolitionist plate, on a jug, on a candlestick, or on an American poster from about 1860, is from Hebrews 13. Remember them that are in bonds. So here the enslaved are being depicted again as brethren, but as oppressed, persecuted Christians. Now, one notable thing about this is if you look at you might not be able to see it too clearly, but if you look at the posture of the enslaved woman on the plate, and you can see it more clearly here, she is actually holding the Bible. So the Bible starts to function in some of this sort of iconography as having a symbolic value. And on one of these particular prints, she's actually saying the words, this book tell man not to be cruel, oh that massa would read this book. So the book is being positioned as on the side of the slaves rather than the enslaved. And it's a key turning point because instead of thinking about Christian masters ruling over heathen slaves, we now have an image of heathen masters oppressing Christian slaves. And the Christianization of the slave population, which is gathering pace by the 1810s and 1820s, allows the story to be told in a very different way. Or here's an image of Olaudah Equiano, one of the most important of the black abolitionists, publishes a best-selling autobiography, The Interesting Narrative of Olaudah Equiano, in 1789. And he is being displayed, showing himself very much as an insider. I mean, his clothes tell you that he's sort of westernized and English. His literacy tells you that. He's staring out at the reader as if he's your equal. But he's also holding the Bible open at Acts chapter 4. And it's the text about salvation being found in no other name than the name of Christ. This is a conversion narrative. And as well as being a narrative of emancipation, he's also going to tell you the story of his own religious conversion. Or take these really striking enamel figures from the 1820s, quite extraordinary in terms of what they show about the way in which identities are being reconfigured by the abolitionist movement. What you have here is a rather primal image of a liberated slave alongside this sort of very delicate image of Britannia. And they're placed side by side, and Britannia is obviously being reimagined, repositioned in terms of its mission of emancipation. Britain is now being seen as a land which has this mission of protection of the enslaved. So this is perhaps linked to what Yvonne was saying yesterday in terms of the reimagining of empire in this kind of gentler way. It's still empire, it's still about Britain's power in the world, but Britain is now being reimagined as a protector. And what sort of links the two is the Bible. So the Bible is actually the book on the floor between the liberated slave and Britannia. And you can see this other image shows you a slave kneeling with the Bible. And here the address is not to a white liberator, but it's clearly designed as a kind of, this is somebody in prayer, so it's kind of... Or look at this picture. This is a medal struck in 1807 to commemorate the abolition of the slave trade by Britain. It again reminds you of how much British anti-slavery was about reimagining religious national identity. So we have Britannia, and she's flanked by mercy and justice, and the angel of victory hovers over her head with the crown. But underneath on the plinth, and this is not usually noted by historians who look at it, there's a phrase, I have heard their cry, which is kind of Britannia speaking, but of course if you're biblically versed, it's also what Yahweh says in Exodus chapter 3. It's telling you that God has heard the cry of the enslaved, and through the agency of Britain, they've now been delivered, at least from the Atlantic slave trade. You get the same thing in the 1830s with the abolition of slavery itself. Here we have an emancipated slave, the name of the kind of great abolitionist Wilberforce over their head. But beneath it, Isaiah 58, the text about releasing the oppressed, about breaking the bonds of the captives. And that text is also used on abolitionist medals, as it is here. It's also used on envelopes. In the 1850s, there are a series of anti-slavery envelopes which are circulated. This one bears a text from Acts 17 about all nations being of one blood, which becomes one of the great abolitionist proof texts to emphasize the unity of humanity. But here again, we see how it's projecting a new image of Britain. So Britain is a protector of the slave. On the other side, you can see in the Caribbean the abuse of slaves in the Caribbean islands. And in the distance, you can see a British patrol ship which is trying to stop the Atlantic slave trade. And a similar image here, struck in 1834, proclaiming that British emancipation, West Indian emancipation, is the Lord's doing. It's a kind of providential act. So just to finish, what this imagery does, I think, is a number of things. But on the one hand, it provides mementos, if you like, to remind people of the cause. It furnishes the cause with many of its key slogans: deliver the captives, proclaim liberty throughout the land, let my people go, and so on. It also they also teach you a particular way of reading the Bible and how you should apply the Bible and how you should read the contemporary situation into the biblical text itself. And it uses the biblical text to redefine identities, the identity of the enslaved, the identity of slaveholders, who are now seen as oppressors and Egyptian taskmasters and so on. It reconfigures the identity of Britain itself, and it also projects a view of abolitionist identity, that the abolitionists themselves are positioned as deliverers, as prophetic figures who are carrying out the prophetic command to break every yoke. Thanks.